Hello, and welcome to episode 192 of Quarkus Insights. Today we've got KimJohn Quinn as our guest, giving us an update on what Logicdrop is doing with Quarkus.
Hello.
Hello. Sorry, we've just switched to the new Restream UI, and so I lost the button to make the title screen go away. So tech fail already.
Something I was thinking about as we were getting ready to join here. I don't know how much you're familiar with Saturday Night Live. Here in the U.S., I know KimJohn is probably familiar with Saturday Night Live, but you get certain hosts or certain people that have guest hosted forever. I think KimJohn. I think this is like you've been the guest here more than anybody else. So we can call
Sweet.
you. What's his name there? The name just flew out of my head. The guy that either it'll come back to me, but yeah. So welcome back. Good to have you back. Good to see you again. It's been a year and a half.
It's been 4 years. Oh well, since the last presentation, it's been a couple of years.
Yeah, Alec Baldwin. That's who I was thinking about. I told you it would come to me in a second.
Yeah, I think you're definitely like a friend of the show, and yeah, sort of a regular guest, which is really nice, and it means we can sort of get an update too on sort of your journey from when you first started using Quarkus to now you're like super veteran with Quarkus.
Cool. Yeah, we are. I will tell you right off the bat, we are very strong champions of Quarkus, not only with our clients, but our whole platform. In fact, everything that we do has been moved over to the Quarkus ecosystem at this point. So we are all in on Quarkus, and we've been, hence the retrospective, we've been using it now for closer to 5 years.
Wow.
Almost since you were released. I think we started out in the 1.0 version with our experimentation and our proof of concepts, and we were looking to move from a Spring Boot environment to a different stack. We were just not happy with building out our product in Java, and so we were evaluating other technologies, Python, we looked at C#, we did look at other stacks within the Java ecosystem like Micronaut, is it Helidon, and Quarkus. And within the first couple of weeks, I can tell you the triggering point, we were trying to set up OIDC. And we started out using Quarkus, and it was a few configuration changes, and it had hooked into our Auth0 provider. And at that point, we were practically sold, because if you looked at the code we had built out in Spring Boot for OIDC, I don't think to this day any one of us actually knows what it does. And then there was issues with versioning, and there was issues with dependency injection. Spring Boot was great in theory, but applying it to a large enterprise application tended to be very challenging. So we were spending a lot of cycles maintaining, trying to figure out a lot of magical things, how dependency injection worked. Why did that bean get overridden by another bean? How's our configuration being applied? Because it seems to change every time we deploy it, depending on the order of the beans being loaded. We were really frustrated. And what you'll see here is an actual comparison of metrics that we pulled. And we study our metrics for development extremely, very detailed. And you'll see it's pretty large difference between what our process was before to what our process is now using Quarkus. And it's not to say that it's just a technology thing. It's not just the Quarkus stack. You could argue that it's architectural or other issues, but all around, we pretty much replicated the architecture using Quarkus, and we're finding that overall, not only has our process improved drastically, but our costs have been reduced also drastically. So,
Before you go on, KimJohn, we should probably back up for people who haven't been watching Quarkus Insights for 5 years to sort of give a little bit of an introduction to, to who you are and to what Logicdrop does.
Sure. So we have built a platform that enables our customers to build their own BPM and rule-based solutions that they can deploy into the cloud, any number of environments at will. We're not a no-code solution. We're not a low-code solution. Our philosophy has been developers and business analysts do what they do best. Let them do it. We'll just simplify everything that surrounds building an enterprise service that you can expose and test automatically. So in a sense, we've blended the CI/CD processes with the Quarkus stack and enabled the clients to write code, build and deploy native or JVM-based services, and everything around that, the Kubernetes configuration, security, aliasing the ingresses, meshing the services together is all handled by our platform. So in most cases, our clients can write, and I'll just say, use Hello World as an example. They can write Hello World, click a button, deploy it out to the cloud, and then create whatever mesh that they need to wire their services together automatically.
Nice.
It's actually really cool.
Yeah. I mean, you do have a bias, but it does sound. Yeah,
if it wasn't very cool, you probably wouldn't still be working there, right?
Yeah.
But it speeds up their processes. It saves our clients a lot of money, whether it be infrastructure, long development cycles, even just experimenting or getting into Quarkus and being able to build on a new stack. We have a lot of clients that use Spring or conventional Java, and they have mission critical services that they need to build and deploy, but all the effort to get set up and prepared is usually too much work. So they want something that's going to let them write their code, build their BPMs, and then they don't really care about all the other stuff. They just want to get it out there. And that's what our platform does.
Nice. And so I know you've got some slides, which I'm not actually showing at the moment. Do you want me to be sharing your slides?
Where was that screen share button? Oh,
no,
it says
you're sharing on your side. I'm just not sending it out.
Oh, sure.
I can, if you would like everyone to see your screen, I will fix that.
Please.
But we might need to. Yeah.
Bad host.
I know. We might need to rewind a bit. Sorry. So we're now sharing your slides.
All right. Well, I kind of gave the overview of who we are, and to set the stage too, we're not a Google or a huge giant company, but for what our clients use our platform for and what they run, it's continuous. It's pretty intensive. We're running hundreds of thousands of rules all day long. We're running BPMs all day long, 24/7. And we actually are, in most cases, handling the mission critical services for our clients with our platform. And they rely on our system for anything around the rules and the BPM processes. We really don't have any slack to go down. because they need it all the time. And a good example is foodstuffs out in New Zealand. Millions of products run through our system 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. And if our system fails, products are not only miscategorized, but potentially could have issues because we do a lot of comparisons of ingredients. And if
Mm.
those ingredients are wrong, people can get sick. Or
Yeah.
because of government standards, foodstuffs has to comply with certain regulations. If they fail to comply with those, they're fined considerably. So all of our services that are built out on top of Quarkus are not toy projects. They're not small projects. They have to work 100% of the time.
Yeah.
And we consume running Quarkus, we'll consume anywhere from 15 to 30,000 requests a day on average. And in our previous environment, we would run into issues with heaps or general Java issues of the services going down, being restarted, resource requirements within Kubernetes. We honestly have not hit very many of those since moving to Quarkus. In fact, we've probably had far more reliability in our services that have been built in Quarkus than we did in our previous platform.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit because as Eric said, you've been here for such a long time, and you've been on Quarkus Insights several times, and you adopted Quarkus in 1.0, which was an early adopter, but it was not it was not the earliest adopter, because I think it was Vodafone Greece adopted Quarkus in, I can't remember what it was, but it was something like version 0.2 or 0.3 or 0.4, and then it was sort of, we kind of talked to them. We were like, that's, we appreciate your confidence, and the reason was because they had almost nothing to lose. They sort of, I mean, here I'm telling their story, but as I remember hearing it, but they're having the sort of the Kubernetes death cycle that I think everybody who's used Kubernetes has experienced at least once, where your system is using too many resources, and so then your pods get killed before they can come up, which then just makes it worse. And so then the whole cluster dies. And so they had nothing to lose. They switched to Quarkus, and they were very happy.
Oh, yeah, and I'll get into that cluster density a little bit, because aside from just being able to do more with our clusters, the cost savings that
Yeah.
we have seen, and one of the numbers that I'm going to show is an actual number that I pulled live from our recent sunsetting of a legacy Kubernetes cluster. But this is kind of our timeline, and again, we track everything that we do, so there may be a few hiccups in here, but this is pretty much how we adopted Quarkus from 2020 all the way to 2024. And in 2020, really for us, we were experimenting, prototyping, just getting a feel for Quarkus and how it worked, and really trying to see, compared to our legacy platform, do we have this issue still? How do we get around this? So we worked through a lot of our bad experiences in 1.0 to get that warm fuzzy of how it would work. And then come 2.0 is when we decided to ground up rewrite our whole platform in Quarkus, and at the same time retool our whole CI system to be very Quarkus friendly. And we've got a killer CI/CD system that builds out the Quarkus executables all at a button click. We can literally push every single one of our services in about 45 minutes end to end. And individual services we can push out, takes about 8 to 10 minutes if you're building them natively, which almost all of our services are native executables. I think we have 3 that are not, and it's only because we carried over some legacy stuff And Apache Ignite was not going to run native, and we have Drools 9, which is just a temporary, since we were trying to just move all of our services over. So you can see kind of the progression here as we go from 2.0 to 3.0 of where we've introduced the various extensions. And you'll note that they're almost all Quarkus related extensions. Aside from, excluding transitive dependencies, everything that we do is probably originating from a Quarkus extension. So our POMs, our Maven POMs, are extremely clean because it's just Quarkus. And we know exactly where everything is. We know what version everything is. We know where to find the doco for everything. It's made the whole build configuration a lot easier. There have been a lot of times where I have wrestled with Maven for days to try to understand where an optional dependency was coming from or what's knocking something out. We just don't have those problems anymore with Quarkus. Or if we do, they're so minor, I can't even recollect them.
That's really cool.
Yeah, I'd be interested in, you said most of your stuff is native, like the reasoning in talking about like why you decided to do that versus being on the JVM.
I was going to ask the exact same question.
So for us, running native offered a lot of advantages. The first and maybe one of the most important was the size. So when we were generally running JVM based in images in our cluster, we're looking at a 1.5 to 2 gigs compressed container size that's coming down. We were very limited as to the resources in the cluster, which meant we had to have more nodes because we couldn't support as many pods in the cluster. When we went to native, we're able to pack double the number of pods on the same node size that we were before. Also, by going to native, the biggest one was really the cluster density. The native images offered us a much smaller container size. Startup, it's equivalent between the native and the JVM. Maybe faster in the native side, but it just gave us benefits from the cluster resources as to how much we could deploy. And that changed our process quite a bit because by using the native images, where we might just have a staging and a production cluster, we were able to introduce full preview clusters based on a merge request. So when our developers want to deploy their own cluster, they can build the services as native and they can deploy them from their merge request as an isolated environment, because we can actually put more on our clusters and we're not spinning up additional nodes.
That's cool.
So, and then, other things, compiling it native, we have less of a security surface area to worry about. Yeah. Again, performance wise, the JVM performance actually now in thinking about it, because we have the one that runs Drools, it's definitely slower than the native startup. And this also affects us a lot because we run everything in Knative. So having fast startup, having small containers, this all adds up in the end. And that's really, to us, the biggest benefit of going native.
You had me at Knative.
Oh, wait. Yeah.
You just said Knative, that would have answered the
We're actually also, you'll see there in here in 2024, almost all of our services are Knative. So we're almost completely native executables. And I seriously am pretty sure, I think we have 2, maybe 3 JVM based images only. And this is out of 40 plus core services. And then what our clients deploy themselves. And they can choose between native and JVM. We suggest they go with native once it's production ready, but use the JVM for testing and iterations just because it's faster. And this year, all of our services went to Knative.
Are you thinking of going from Drills 9 to Drills 10?
Better. We've been running the Kajito snapshot, the 999 snapshot, and they just released 10, and we've already updated to it. We're testing it, and we're going to move to that thing as fast as possible, because right now, so you'll see in 2022, when we rewrote our platform, we still have clients that are deploying Kajito 2.6, which means we're running along the 2x line of Quarkus just for those services. And it's been kind of a pain. Especially though, the biggest one that killed us there was the whole Jakarta JavaX. We have components. We have a really nice component library we've built out in Quarkus, and we kept having to backport things. But the way that we structured it, it sounds worse than it is. It honestly hasn't been horrible. And like I said, we have services that are running still side by side with our 3.0 line that are in 2x. So we just want to move to Kajito and get all the dependencies in sync. And we're not only using Kajito, we're also using Sonata Flow, or I think it was Kajito serverless workflow before. We're also using that. So it's just nice to have all of the versions in line.
Yeah.
So that's kind of our timeline. And it shows the progression as we became more and more comfortable, where we started out with just a few extensions, Helm, Redis, those were our big ones. Then we moved into Kafka, and we started building on the Kubernetes client. We introduced Dash Builder. We had OptiPlanner, the serverless workflow. We started moving everything to native. And then in 2024, we really exploded because we took in Tecton, we took in the JGit extension, Kafka Streams, Quarkus messaging. We're experimenting with LangChain. We have Timefold in there working. We already have the Kajito 10 upgrade, and everything's working there. Because we just didn't want to manage any more legacy services, we moved our old platform, but we upgraded Drools to 9. We're still using Ignite 2. A lot more emphasis on Redis. So Kafka was a little bit too heavy within our own platform. So we're using Redis Pub Sub and Streams within our own platform internally. And then a lot with Tecton. We pipe our logs. So FluentBit collects everything in our system. We pipe FluentBit to, we take the OTLP from the services, push it to FluentBit instead of the OTel collector, and then we pump everything that we do, logs, observability, into Loki, Grafana, Tempo.
By complete coincidence, both Eric and I were just looking at that code, and it's neither of us know anything about that code, and we both ended up having to make changes in that code and kind of putting in the PRs going, I think this is right.
Is that on the OTel side?
Yeah.
Oh,
the observability stack, and then the tests are flaky, and both of us are like, did we break something?
Yeah.
It's two separate PRs that are totally unrelated to each other. But
it's been challenging. That's been interesting to configure, just especially with a lot of the changes happening in it. But one of the cool things we found is we got rid of the OTel collector in the cluster. And we instead pump from Quarkus, we pump the OTel metrics to Fluent, and then we use Fluent to manipulate those and send them out to Tempo. And that's worked really well for us, actually.
And we've got,
cool.
yeah.
We really like the Grafana Loki tempo stack. We dropped Elastic. I said everything we have. We use the Quarkus JSON logging extension. We enrich the message, of course, with a ton of attributes, and we have full visibility into our system from one place.
So there's a question about, have you come across any issues where you're running multiple Quarkus versions with running extensions with multiple versions of Quarkus?
Oh, I'm going to get into that. I actually have a slide for that. So this is kind of an overview of how moving to Quarkus has really revolutionized our process. And what's, I think, very telling is that I pretty much presented the same slide about 4 years ago. And the predictions that we made based on the metrics that we were seeing have held pretty consistent. They haven't changed very much. Our average time to onboard a developer is 1 to 3 days. Our average time to perform a feature, a bug fix, and testing is less than a week. Our deployment time is just ridiculous. We used to schedule a full day once a month to do a production build. I was actually just sitting on the phone when we were jumping on this presentation, and I saw somebody pushing a production deploy while I was on the phone. It takes 40 minutes for us to go across all of our services. One specific project might be in that 15, 20-minute range. And that time isn't coming because the build is slow or takes long. It's because of native builds, and we're running them in parallel. So it's very easy for us to push builds, and they tend to be pushed a lot more frequently, which means we're getting features out faster. The testing overall has been a lot easier, a lot more fluid, a lot more streamlined for us. And we're able to hit pretty good coverage. And they're not even fluffy tests. These are real tests that are mostly going through scenarios of functionality. So it's not like checking is a value null or not. It's running through a process of how I invoke a Tecton pipeline and what do I expect there, and did it push the right message? So they're pretty heavy tests.
Do you know off the top of your head what your mix is? Because we were discussing this last week, what your mix is between the @Quarkus test and the @Quarkus integration test and @Quarkus component test?
I can actually give you that number roughly. 125 unit, 131 integration, 71 end-to-end, and then we've got some other end-to-end ones for specific services like Keycloak and Redis. But I can give you the full number of what that is.
How often do you find where you're doing like a full production deployment, like the full set of services versus individual services? About the same, more of the individual services, more of let's just do everything in one shot?
It's so easy to do a full deploy that oftentimes, because of our versioning, we'll shoot it out that way. But maybe through the week, you'll see a lot more of that individual services here and there. And again, our developers can run and deploy services into their own isolated namespaces within the cluster, and they can deploy just the service they're working on. That'll automatically wire up to the production services, or they can choose to deploy the whole cluster as well. We have an interesting approach where our developers don't generally interact with the cluster unless they need to. So everything that we do in Quarkus, and this is something that's been really game changing for us. Our developers can run the full environment locally with no problems. We've invested a lot of time into WireMock. They can run an individual service as if they had the full cluster locally too. So we do a lot of development locally, and we rely on CI/CD to verify that everything works, especially in the end-to-end scenarios. And then once that's merged in, at that point, we're pretty much ready for production.
So have you built, so I assume you're using, because I know there's the WireMock dev service. Have you switched over to that? Because that wasn't there 4 years ago.
No, we're using just the Quarkus WireMock extension. So dev services,
I guess that's what I'm asking, because the extension didn't exist 4 years ago.
No, we use just regular WireMock.
Gotcha.
And then we moved to the WireMock extension, but we'd already set up kind of our scaffolding around WireMock, how we build the stubs and how we set up all of the JSON requests. And that's been our primary go-to for all of our testing for quite a while. Almost since, I want to say we started using WireMock, and then recently we just updated it.
I don't know, Holly, if you probably have an interest in this next question that I've got. I'm sorry to be hogging the thing, but
okay.
I have to jump off in about 10 minutes. But are you doing any kind of end-to-end contract testing?
We are evaluating going to PACT this year. So that's going to be the one that we're going to look at. As far as like expertise or being able to talk about it intelligently, I don't have enough background to talk about it, but we do, from what we see, it looks like PAC would be very helpful for our testing and might actually help standardize the process a lot more, especially across services.
Well, right up above you, you've got the maintainer of the PACT extension. So, yeah. And down here, you've got a contributor to it.
Yeah, and I've been saying for about 2 years as well that the extension sort of fixed the problem of just getting the PACT to cooperate with the Quarkus class loading, but I think there's more that could be done, but it's been blocked by the great test class loading rewrite, which I've been saying is almost done for 2 years, but it really is almost done. And so then when that happens, I'm hoping that to invest a bit more time into the PACT extension. So I'll come to you for beta guinea pig testing.
Oh, we absolutely. What's really interesting, so we run Renovate in our background. Pretty much as soon as you push an update, we have the update. We've run it through our paces and we've rolled it out. So even though it's probably a good idea to stay on the long-term deployment, our general day-to-day, we're running the latest and greatest of anything that's in your ecosystem. And we've had minimal problems with it. Our client-facing POMs, we do pin to the long-term. But, 4 years, and we literally update within the week at most, as soon as you push an update.
So I guess, Holly, the last 10% of the task takes 90% of the time. Is that true?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's it's a classic in our industry, isn't it? Of like real soon now. And we've got Max couldn't join us because he's on a plane, but that didn't fully keep him away. So we've got a comment from Max saying sorry for not being able to join this time, but he just wanted to say thanks, KimJohn, for because you keep sharing your story, which we love, and it's one of Max's favorite success stories, and it's really cool to see sort of what's changed and the updates. So thank you from me as well.
I think this is the cool slide.
So if Max is on a plane and he's able to see that you're here, that means he's live streaming this on a plane.
Yeah, I mean, maybe he's sort of like somewhere in an airport.
So this is the one that we thought, this is what really triggered me suggesting that we do this retrospective. these are based off of real measurements of tasks. I used a contrived value, but these are pretty close to real values and real time and real metrics that we see in our system. And the very first one is the difference in cluster costs that we see. And this is almost exact. We just sunset a cluster that was running us about $3,000 a month. Our Quarkus cluster, the equivalent, is about $1,200 a month. So we've got a 60% savings there. Our onboarding time, say 40 hours roughly, is about a day. We can bring a developer up in the Quarkus ecosystem. Here's the code. Do you know Java? Do you know the Java standards? Have fun. Here's some features and bugs to fix. So huge difference of 1 day versus a week of onboarding. Taking a moderate feature within a sprint, we're saying 2 weeks. On average, we turn around smaller features, smaller bug fixes in fractions of the time using Quarkus. And because so much is rolled into Quarkus and how it's configured and how it's deployed, we spend a lot less time having to deal with operations, because we don't have to wait for a Helm chart to be built out or the cluster to be configured. We can just push our services out there. So we're seeing across the board significant cost savings in every aspect since moving to Quarkus, whether it's faster support, the warm up, the container size, which minimizes our cluster costs, the time it takes to train, and there's just the productivity boost that we have makes moving to Quarkus completely worth it.
Yeah, this is so interesting because I think everybody knows, oh, Quarkus makes your machine costs less. And so, Quarkus saves you money on that side. But I think some people are sometimes a bit nervous and they think, oh, well, my team have built up a whole bunch of skills in some other platform. And, Quarkus hasn't been around for 15 years. So I don't have, 15 years worth of training to, of people to draw on. But, this is saying that you definitely don't need to worry about that because it's easier and more productive. So
we think it's easier to move to Quarkus because
Yeah.
the fact that everything's Java standards, that was one thing that we really wrestled with Spring. There's the Spring way and then there's the Java way. And we used to retrofit Spring. For example, we went to CXF and I'm trying to think what we ended up rebuilding a lot because we wanted to fit into the JAX-RS spec better with the reactive flows. And you go to Quarkus and pretty much everything is, if you know CDI, it's not going to be that hard for you to find anything on it. If you know regular Java, everything is at your fingertips. So we actually found it easier to move people to Quarkus than we did to bring them up to speed on Spring or any other framework.
And we've got the critical update as well, which is that Max is not live streaming on a plane; he is live streaming on a train. So
it's a nice limerick.
yeah, I'm not going to try and say that 6 times quickly.
So I mean, this slide, there's not a lot to talk about here. I think everyone is aware of why using Quarkus as a developer is a lot of fun. Quarkus Dev is, it's so nice not to have to run Maven install repeatedly. That alone makes it worth it. The Quarkus Dev has just been super stable for developing live and seeing your changes immediately. I don't know, I see comments that fly around about the documentation, but personally, I think the documentation is pretty stellar. I've never found anything, or I've never not found anything in the documentation. The examples are not so simple that they're useless in the real world, they've always given me a pointer to how to do what I need to realistically. And outside of the documentation, it should be said about just the Quarkus team and the responsiveness. I don't think I've ever filed an issue in Quarkus that within 1 to 2 weeks was resolved. I can think of a nice anecdotal story. We hit a production issue on a Friday night with the JGIT extension. Created the reproducer. I pushed it out there. I can't remember the owner of the extension, but he commented back, and somehow we got into 2 or 3 hours of working through it, fixing it, and I ended up pushing to production that night a few hours later. I think that speaks volumes to Quarkus, the team, and the ecosystem, because in no other open source project have I ever sat on the line with a developer for a few hours and rolled something out. Not to say they're not helpful, but I think that sets a very high bar. And that's really been our experience interacting with the Quarkus team. It just no complaints on that side.
Let me ask a somewhat selfish question here. So the sample app that's out there, the superheroes, do you find it useful? And if not, is there anything that we could add to that would help you and your teams?
Oddly, I don't use that one that much, but I did look at I did look at it for the where I'll look at it is kind of how you approach some of the problems and the patterns. And then I did look at it for the pub sub or the Redis queue, but I was looking more along the lines of pub sub. So I needed a little bit of a different example, but it did guide me down the path of how to set up the multi. I pretty regularly go through the code base on GitHub as well as the extensions and the doco. It's almost like a hobby. So I've probably looked at everything and then pinned it because, oh, that's a good example of how to do this, or that's a good example of this. So I frequently refer to those projects to look for patterns of how to approach something. And that's another thing that's been really helpful because I can find them all.
Cool.
So this is where you were asking about the multiple versions. And these are just some of our lessons that we've learned. And a lot of them are probably common sense. Check the documentation, Zulip, or the groups. Like I said, we've just had phenomenal success using all of those. We have gotten into a pattern of trying to make sure that if we have an extension that's very critical, isolating it, exposing it, whether it's through a REST client or some topic, but making sure that we have that running in a service that we can deploy standalone. And this has saved our butt with the Quarkus stuff, because running Quarkus 2.6 and then running everything else in 3, that's enabled us to manage multiple versions of Quarkus at the same time if we need to. Now, most of our stuff, in fact, I think everything right now is in 3. Kajito 10, we have an issue with the latest version, but the last long-term release, it works perfectly fine. So this gives us that flexibility to run multiple versions when we need to, and take it at our own pace how to update it. We found a lot can be done through configuration. In fact, a surprisingly lot of stuff that we would normally write code for can oftentimes be done in the configuration, and it's humbling. Spending the time to build out test harnesses, like even when we do go to pack or we start to expand more on our wire mock harness, Having that in place allows us to make the changes centrally and apply it across the board automatically, because we like to have some consistency in our testing and just make sure everyone's doing everything the same way. Profiles, of course, are extremely handy. And maybe the most important thing we've found, and again, coming from writing some pretty heavy Java code, a lot of reflection, keeping things simple. In a lot of cases, we've written code only to find out Quarkus has something that's equivalent or better. So don't reinvent the wheel if you don't necessarily need to. There's a pretty good chance that it's already in your ecosystem or it's already been accommodated for. So make sure to do some research before you set out on this huge endeavor to build something. From the native side, definitely build and test your executables, whether it's the executable doesn't build or testing. Always make sure to do that at some point before the end of the day. Use the Maven, use Maven to build your native executable. We thought at one point we'd get real fancy and build our own Graal container to do the build because it would save us time. The problem is that every time Mandrill or Graal updated, our container would be out of date and the build would fail. So we just said, we're just going to use Maven and go along with it. We've also gotten in the habit of creating REST test cases for critical services that aren't necessarily REST services, just so we can test them natively. It's just made native testing a lot easier. And then lastly, this has been our trend for issues within Quarkus. It's an issue. It requires a workable update or a configuration change. Generally nothing crazy. It's something we can reproduce, which again, our experiences, 1 to 2 weeks, we've seen those issues come right out, which is also part of the reason why we upgrade all the time. Downgrade Quarkus, which is pretty rare, but it has happened. And even then, to do that downgrade, it's changing the version in the POM and pushing out a build. It's not a lot of retrofitting. And then the bane of our life is register for reflection. That is seriously, I would say 80 to 90% of our issues are register for reflection.
It's when you want to have the autoresponder on your internal issue tracker that just says, have you tried register for reflection?
You joke. That is internally for us. That is typically the response. Have you looked to see if it's register for reflection? No, that's really the one. That's the one we hit most often. And generally, they're pretty recognizable. We definitely need to do better work in testing our native services for some of those. But it's hard to tell when it's going to crop up and where it's going to crop up. Is it in the middle of the class the hierarchy? I found that one this weekend. But that's really our worst bug that we hit, and we know what to do when we see it.
Yeah, and I guess that's just sort of a side of a function, isn't it? Of like that you do so much with natives.
It is. And that's maybe the killer, because even with our coverage when we're running, again, we're hitting about 88% coverage JVM wise, and then again, we're testing pretty intensively. The native ones, it could be a property, or the one we just had was in our Redis pub sub. Because they're not exposed RESTfully, they're of course not getting picked up, but we're passing messages, and the Redis decoder, Jackson, or object mapper, the object mapper for Jackson isn't picking it up. And we had register for reflection on the implementation, but we didn't have it in the middle of the chain. So the classes in the middle weren't getting picked up, and we would get some of the properties, but we couldn't figure out why we were missing a batch of properties in between. And we replicated it locally. And then once we realized it, it actually came about. I was starting to write the reproducer, and I accidentally put register for reflection in between. And all of a sudden I saw my properties, and I jumped back and made the change. I was like, oh.
Yeah. Jackson reminds me, have you tried the reflection-free Jackson serializer?
Yes, we have been testing that. I'm not sure yet on my response yet. We've had issues, but we haven't dove into them yet. Right now, most of our services are enabled with reflection free. We had some issues in Timefold, but I'm going to guess that it's because of the use of the JSON annotation properties that make up the model, and not necessarily straight up reflection free serialization. It's a lot of JSON. There's the JSON relationships with the identity and all that stuff that tie it together. So I'm going to guess it's that. We're almost at a point where we're pretty comfortable with the reflection free. In fact, I owe somebody an answer on Zulip on that, because we had used Afterburner before with Jackson, and that did show us a pretty big performance boost. So we're still vetting it out, but we're getting really close to confidence on that.
Nice.
I try everything. I flip every switch in your options file to see what happens, what it does. And this is why I read them all the time. Like, ooh, what's that? And then I start looking it up, and then I'll try it. Well, here's an example of a production release that ran through our CI. We have trigger jobs. We use GitLab a lot. That's worked really well for configuring things. And you can see it's pushed out the image and deployed to. And this was actually, there was one done while we were talking. So this is a little older, but that's how frequent we do the production releases. You can see we run, every single service has its own version. So we're managing all of our own versions. Most of the stuff is running against the same Quarkus version, with the exception of a few other services. And this is just one project. This isn't like the whole thing. And then from a merge request, developers can push, and if they choose to, as soon as I find the right view, they can push their services up to the cluster, and it's as if they were running their own environment. It's all isolated to its namespace. It's all rewired for the merge request. So instead of going to logicdrop.com/API, it's MR127400/API, and everything's wired together automatically there. And that is our retrospective.
That's
4 years and going.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I'd love to go back now, because I pasted a few links to some of your earlier Insights episodes, and it'd be fun to go back and like compare what you were sort of saying, when you were first started using Quarkus to now, and the sort of the.
Oh, that's another thing. That was a new improvement. So we've blended our UX development with our service development. So we're taking advantage of one project that has both the UX and the APIs. And from a tracking perspective, it's amazing, because before we used to have to create tickets, and you weren't sure what ticket related to what. Now they're all in one place. And an API developer can muck around with a UX front end and vice versa. And also we can include services specifically for the WebJar or the web UX and use them so we can build almost supporting components that aren't necessarily meant to be exposed, but help out like in auth or, certain client functionality. And that's been really cool to do. So we've actually moved almost all of our UX development into those now mixed bag UX and API components.
That's really nice. Are you using Quinoa for that, or Web Bundler, or
The what is it? The WebJar. We've got some Maven plugins that work through that.
Yeah, and so we've got Web Bundler that lets you put your JavaScript dependencies into your POM file.
It might be that one. It might be that one. I'm not as familiar with those dependencies.
Yeah.
I stay as far away from the UX as possible. I don't care if they're mixed together. So yeah, I don't know if there's any questions or anything. Hopefully it was insightful.
Yeah, super. Yeah, lived up to the name. And we've got a question which I think is probably, I don't know if that's probably for both of us. Does Quarkus with Hibernate and Panache use reflection? I'm not sure.
You want me to answer that? At least from the MongoDB side, the Panache, MongoDB Panache does not use reflection. And as a side note on that, there's static methods that can come with the Mongo entity, or you can go with the conventional repository approach. Highly would suggest the conventional repository approach versus the statics because they're a pain to test. And also it just makes it, you'll run into an issue when you're in the native testing side with those, because even though you think you're using the static stuff, it's, if you write it outside of your native test, it's still using injection. So you can't really use it like for post and pre cleanup stuff. I told you I dig into this stuff.
Yeah, and that's sort of as a more general note on reflection and Quarkus in general. A lot of the sort of the model of Quarkus is to replace reflection with what we sometimes call offline reflection. And so the idea is that you get the same capabilities that you would get with reflection in terms of introspecting the code and having libraries be able to introspect the code, but without the runtime cost of reflection and without it completely breaks everything in native downside of reflection.
I guess you're right. The extension itself does to inspect the annotations, but yeah, the actual produced library is clean from it. No, it's what's funny. So I love reflection. I did everything with reflection before. I miss it, but it does simplify the code a lot. It's just a lot cleaner. Not doing a bunch of finagling with, is your property accessible, or trying to did it have get before it? So I miss reflection, but I don't too.
And I know we're out of time, but we've got a couple more questions that have come in at the last minute. So was it easy for you to find developers who are familiar with Knative?
Knative, it has its nuances, but for the most part, being able to explain those nuances, all of our developers started out not being familiar with Knative. It wasn't a deep learning curve to bring them in. In fact, the minimalistic scenario is you can flip in your Quarkus configuration to it's a Knative service. You're not going to take advantage of very much, but you can do that. And for all intents and purposes, it works the same. There is it's more configuration. In fact, funny story, we messed up the configuration. We forgot to set the request or the timeout of the service. So we had this client hitting their API literally 30,000 times a day. They messed up too on their side. These were in Knative services that were shutting down like in 60 seconds, but Quarkus held up and supported it for many weeks without a problem. So these things were just, we were watching native services go up and down all day long, and we thought it was hilarious. And then we, of course, configured it properly, but it held up really well.
Yeah. We've got one last question as well, which is, it looks like you've separated out the tests by type, so end-to-end unit integration. Is there a reason for that?
Yes. Well, we want our unit tests to run as fast as possible with no dependencies, no database, nothing. They're pure, they are really unit. We consider integration to be anything that interacts with a data store, persistence, Mongo, Postgres, whatever. Those tend to be kind of critical to us, that they are reading and writing correctly. So that's also a pipeline stop break if they break. We have EDE tests that we consider to be full sets of services as well as external containers. So we know for the most part, Redis, Mongo, local stack, those are like kind of built into our general EDE. Kafka, well, Kafka is a great example. That's also an EDE, but we separate that out because those tend to be very heavy. So for us, EDE is as close to the full environment as possible, including any external containers. Integration is purely persistence. Unit is mock and no dependencies.
Yeah, makes sense. And with that, we are over time. So I better let you get back to it and get on to your next meeting. But thank you so much for everything over the years. But then thank you a lot for this episode as well. I think this is just such a useful set of best practices for using Quarkus in the enterprise, and I think it's going to be useful to a lot of people who are already using Quarkus, and also useful to people who are sort of considering it as an option. So thank you again, KimJohn.
Well, thank you for having me. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.